This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for March 2nd, 2020. There is no shortage of criticism of the police, particularly when they interact with minorities. In this podcast, let's hear the view from the other side of the badge.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
Coming up in a few minutes, black people are 2.6 times more likely to get arrested for drug crimes, even though they're committing those crimes at the same rate as white people.
You can get statistical analysis that will say pretty much anything that you want to.
No, this is peer-reviewed research. This is very high-quality research.
Okay, well, let me give you some realities.
That's coming up shortly. First, I want to say thanks to all of my donors on Patreon. I appreciate everyone who contributes. For the people who don't know, Patreon is a website that lets people donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month. That helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. And if you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and also at the end of this show. You might remember that I interviewed Aaron Napperstack of the War on Cars podcast last year. He's a big advocate of non-car-based transport. I don't know what he would make of a story from Luxembourg I saw last week, but I suspect he'd be an enthusiast. I'm not. The story is that Luxembourg has decided to make all public transport free to use in an effort to cut pollution and traffic jams. The country has an extensive network of trams, trains and buses, and from now on, you can just hop on and go anywhere, no charge. I say extensive, but of course the country is tiny. It has a population of just over 500,000, and it's smaller than Rhode Island, so you could throw a stone across it if you had a good go at it. And it's rich, so they can afford to make the transit system free. They have a big financial services industry, which is a polite way of saying that they launder drug and prostitution money and the funds looted from national treasuries by third world dictators. But that's a different story. Some people are saying that this is the way to go for transit systems. If they're free, then people will leave their cars behind and use these systems that don't cause traffic jams and don't cause as much pollution. Luxembourg isn't the only country going down this line. Scotland is planning to make public transport free for under 18s, and some political parties in Ireland are advocating going the whole way and making the whole system free like in Luxembourg. I think that they're wrong. There are two big mistakes here. The first mistake is the effect that this won't have, and the second mistake is the effect that it will. Let's look at the effect that this won't have first. The thinking is that people who drive will be tempted out of their cars by free public transit. The problem here is that in almost any city in the world, public transit is already much, much cheaper than driving. If saving that much doesn't motivate drivers to get on the bus or the train or whatever, why would anyone think that saving just a little bit more will? This whole scheme totally misunderstands why people drive. Look at the cars on any street. There's a huge variety. You can drive anything from a clanger for under $1,000 to spending several $100,000 on a top-end luxury vehicle. But one thing all of them, except the very cheapest rust bucket, almost all of them have in common is that the driver could have saved a few bucks by getting a cheaper car. From the highest end luxury performance vehicle to the most ordinary car, the driver could have traded down to the next cheapest model. Every single driver, except perhaps the bottom 1%, could have saved a few bucks if they wanted to. But they didn't. They chose to spend more money than they really needed to because they wanted the comfort and the prestige. There's nothing wrong with that, really. I have to say that I do much the same myself with other products. I have a phone that's really much more expensive than the one I need. Probably the same is true for the audio equipment that I use to make this podcast. But if you understand why people do what they do, you have a better chance of understanding how to motivate them to change their behavior. And it's clear that overwhelmingly, finance isn't the main thing that motivates drivers. If making mass transit cheaper could tempt them away from their cars, then it would already have done so. Because in most big cities, mass transit is already vastly cheaper than driving the cars that most drivers drive. But in a lot of cities, there are a lot of people that walk or cycle to their destination. This is the effect that I think making mass transit free will have, even if we don't want it to. Even if drivers aren't motivated to make a modal shift, it's pretty obvious that free public transit will encourage cyclists and walkers to hop on the bus. That doesn't provide any benefit in terms of reducing traffic or pollution, but I'm sure that the walkers and cyclists appreciate it. But the people already riding the bus might not be so happy. Mass transit systems in many cities are already running at capacity. Having walkers and cyclists getting on a few stops before a long-time bus user might mean that they can't fit on, or at the very least that their ride will be a whole lot less comfortable. It might even be so much more uncomfortable as to push those people to drive their journey. And that's the point. All the evidence would indicate that drivers who have a choice to use mass transit and don't choose it do so because they like the comfort and the prestige of driving. So if you have a big wad of money to spend on your city's mass transit system, spending it on making that system free is unlikely to improve anything unless that system is running with loads of spare capacity, which is almost never the case. But if you're thinking of spending that wad to use mass transit to improve pollution and traffic congestion, here's the way to do it. Spend it on making the mass transit cleaner, safer, more regular, more reliable, more extensive, and operating for longer hours. That last point is important, by the way. No point in taking mass transit out for the evening if you can't get home. Supermarkets and radio stations that operate 24 hours don't always do it because they make a profit in the small hours of the morning. They do it because they know that if they don't, their competitor will, and the customer who uses it then once will get used to going to their competitor all the time. And, to be blunt, money should be spent on making mass transit systems more prestigious. Tram and train systems are less prone than buses to getting stuck in traffic, but they are more favoured by the sort of people who could switch to a car as well, partly because saying, "I got the train," sounds a hell of a lot better than "I got the bus." People advocating free mass transit sometimes argue, why can't we do both? Here's why. What you're doing is spending money. Money is limited, or at least it represents limited resources. Every cent you spend on making mass transit free is a cent you didn't spend on making it better. And making it better will always give a better return than making it free.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line, I have Randy Sutton. Randy is a retired police lieutenant from the Las Vegas Police Department. He's also the founder of The Wounded Blue, that's the National Assistance and Support Organization for injured and disabled law enforcement officers. He's also the author of a number of books, including The Power of Legacy, Personal Heroes of America's Most Inspiring People, True Blue, To Protect and Serve, and A Cop's Life, Randy, you were a cop for a long time. You're obviously into writing books about that now. What's the main message you want to get across to people who read your books?
Well, I think the main message is that law enforcement officers are very humans. They're very human people. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of negative media portraying, well, actually dehumanizing America's law enforcement officer, portraying them as brutal, as sadistic, as hunting down minorities and killing them. And the reality is far, far different. The reality is that of the, there's about 900,000 law enforcement officers in the entire United States to police 320 million people. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of them are doing it well and doing it the way they're supposed to and leaving positive impacts on people day in and day out. Mm-hmm. And that's the reality that most of these men and women are policing honorably and with compassion and empathy.
There's a saying about war that it's long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Is that a little bit like what it's like to be a cop?
It is. It is indeed. My career was, I spent 10 years as a policeman in a small community called Princeton. And I actually left there because it was so boring for me. Mm-hmm. And I joined the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department where it was not boring to me. And the difference is that you always have to be prepared for incredible danger. You have to be prepared, quite literally, on every interaction. Now, this is wherever you're a police officer, you have to be of the mindset that you have to go from officer friendly to go into combat mode where you may have to take the life of the person that you're speaking to. And that's a very foreign type of mentality to have for a normal human being. So you have to train for it. You have to prepare. You have to prepare mentally for it. And it's very, very challenging. So that's one of the aspects of law enforcement that really doesn't get a lot of attention, and yet it is the reality that officers live with every single day.
You said that police have been vilified to a degree in the media, and there's certainly, yes, it's certainly controversial. No matter what your belief system is, you couldn't argue that it's controversial. Do you think that some of that criticism is valid?
Well, there are instances where criticism is valid. Believe me, there are mistakes made. There are, men and women who are doing the job that really shouldn't be doing the job. Mm-hmm. There have been people that have been hired that shouldn't have been hired. And there have been, cops who've gone bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that I did during my career and afterwards is I created a presentation to give to law enforcement officers around the country called Policing with Honor, mm-hmm. how to survive your career ethically as well as physically and emotionally. So are there times when police actions deserve criticism? The answer to that is, of course, yes. Are there those that go outside the lines? Are there those that commit murder under the color of office? The answer to that is yes. There are instances that should be criticized where the system, should take action, and that's generally what does happen. The problem is when you have people painting the entire profession with a very wide brush because of the acts committed by a few. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, and we've seen almost an irrational response to some of the instances that took place, and there's also been an absolute avalanche of lies and misinformation. given out about law enforcement.
Okay, pause with that for a second, because you say that there's I think you're saying essentially that some of the criticism is unjustified, and I think you might agree with me that some of those criticism is reflexive. That's to say, people criticize cops almost before they even know the facts of the situation.
Correct.
Is it
Correct.
possible? Is it possible that some of the defense of cops is also reflexive in the same way?
Yeah, I have to say yes. That sometimes we want to jump in and defend actions before we know everything that's going on too. Here's the thing: when there is a major use of force, when someone is shot,
Mm-hmm.
or a major use of force, and somebody dies in custody, an investigation has to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And that investigation, that if you don't get all the facts, you can't make a judgment. And yet we have seen on both sides of the coin, if you will, that happening. We want to believe that, when I say we, I'm talking about the law enforcement community.
Mm-hmm.
We want to believe that we're all acting faithfully, that we're all acting with the best of intentions and doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. We don't want to believe that some of our badge wearing brothers and sisters are coloring outside the lines and committing acts of either criminal acts or misconduct.
I'm interested, Randy, I'm interested that you say badge-wearing brothers and sisters, and that's something that I think most people in other professions wouldn't say. A typical lawyer wouldn't regard another lawyer as a brother or sister. A typical butcher or baker or candlestick maker wouldn't necessarily regard somebody just who does the same job as them in those like fraternal terms. Might that be part of the problem?
Well, I don't know that it's a problem. Perhaps it is a communication that needs to be, emphasized a little more. I mean, the reason that cops consider each other brothers and sisters is because they are literally in the trenches together. There isn't an officer I know that would not literally risk their life for another police officer. And that is not the norm in another profession. Mm-hmm. It is the norm in the military. And that's why there is a camaraderie in the military as well.
Military, hold on, Randy. Military typically have a very clearly defined enemy, and that is an enemy which hopefully the police don't have. And isn't it maybe sometimes the case, especially when you're policing inner city communities or maybe minority communities that are not very well represented in the police, that type of camaraderie puts a barrier between you and the people who you're meant to be protecting and serving?
Not at all. That's nonsense. The reality is that in policing minority communities, which I did for most of my career, mm-hmm. It's the cops who are caring more about the communities than the criminals who are preying on them. I can tell you this from years of experience. Honest citizens in minority communities want the police there. Mm-hmm. They want the police to keep them safe. They ask the police to keep them safe.
Sure, but that's a hell of a low, Randy, that's a hell of a low bar. Of course the cops should be viewed as being the good guys. You can't really set the bar as not being as unpopular as criminals.
I don't know what that statement even means. That wasn't what I was saying.
Okay, go ahead.
You were talking about camaraderie as it corresponds to viewing the citizens as enemies. Mm-hmm. The police don't view their citizens as enemies. They view criminals as enemies. Mm-hmm. As it should be. I mean, mm-hmm. if you are preying on the people that I serve, mm-hmm. and you are willing to commit violence against them or against me, well, you're not my friend, you're my enemy. And I'm going to do everything I can to put you in jail and end the threat that I need to end if it is a combat situation. That camaraderie in law enforcement is an essential part of doing the job. Officers should have a feeling of camaraderie. Let me tell you, even police officers feel camaraderie whether they are even in the same country or not. Because the job is essentially the same whether you are policing in Great Britain or Germany or anywhere else. You are still dealing with the same humanity and human weaknesses and strengths. So that's why there is a camaraderie, because there is a commonality to the experience. Okay. And I don't think that that's unhealthy.
Okay. And you've obviously written a number of books that are centered on the way that police do their jobs. For somebody who has who's never been a cop, who maybe doesn't have an insight as to what that life is like, do you have an anecdote? Do you have something that you can tell that might illustrate to someone like that what that life is like?
That's a great question. And you have just actually hit on a topic that is not really spoken about a lot, and yet has a huge influence on the way people view their police. Most citizens have almost no contact with a law enforcement officer. And when they do, it's generally a negative contact, in that they may be getting stopped for speeding or a traffic violation. The officers may be at their business or at their home because they were victimized. So there's this negative connotation.
One way or another, it's not a happy day often.
It's not a happy, exactly. And I can tell you that the books that I wrote told about the police experience, and when people read them, they view law enforcement officers differently. That was my hope in writing those books, and also in the feedback that I got from my readers, is that, Randy, I never really knew what a cop did or how they felt or what they thought, and that is actually part of a larger issue, in that cops feel isolated oftentimes from the people that they serve because they feel so misunderstood.
And I asked you, can you pull out of your hat an anecdote that might maybe illustrate that for some people who don't have that experience?
Well, I have a million stories about that. I think perhaps we had a very vocal anti-law enforcement community member in Las Vegas. This guy was a very vocal critic of law enforcement, and I had a conversation with him that started off very negatively, let me say. And I invited him to do a ride along with me to see what a law enforcement officer actually does and contends with on a routine day. And there was hesitancy on his part, but eventually he said, okay. And this man rode with me for 10 hours. At the end of that 10 hours, that man was a supporter of law enforcement. The change in the way he felt, he could suddenly empathize, because he couldn't know what it was like to be a cop. And then let's turn that coin around too. He was black, I was white. And during that interaction, he shared things with me that I would never have known, because I had never experienced what he experienced.
For example?
So he was talking about the experiences that he'd had with law enforcement, feeling like he was being preyed upon simply because he was black. And, and when you have a frank discussion about that, and you get to look at other viewpoints, and your mind is open enough to understand and empathize compassionately with the viewpoints of someone else, well, that's the channels of communication that create a relationship, and that's really what needs to happen in order to bridge a lot of the gaps between law enforcement and minority communities.
I have one sort of working theory, and I'll tell you what it is, and you can comment on it then, that obviously there have been some very high-profile cases where particularly black men have died at the hands of police, where it is questioned, to put it very mildly, whether the force used was justified. And those incidents are statistically quite rare, but they make an enormous impact on the culture. Is it possible that those incidents, the reason that so much attention is paid to those incidents, is because they are emblematic for a much larger number of people, particularly black men? They're emblematic of much lower level mistreatment from police, or maybe just discourtesy, or a feeling that they're being stopped when they wouldn't be stopped if they were white. Do you think that that's representing that?
I think it is. I think that there is a mistrust, there is a misunderstanding that takes place. But I also think that there have been many of these instances have been so mischaracterized and used by certain elements in the community as well as media to essentially create a lie about the law enforcement response and about the
what's the lie as you see it?
Well, let's talk about one of a watershed moment in law enforcement history was the Ferguson shooting of Michael Brown.
Yep.
Now, Michael Brown was characterized as this loving giant of a man who never hurt a soul, and that the police, shot him when he had his hands up and saying, "Hands up, don't shoot." Mm-hmm. That was a lie. It didn't happen. It was a fiction.
I'm going to pause you. I'm going to pause you on that, Randy, because I know that there are two sides to that story, and I'm also pretty sure that we're not going to resolve that here because we don't have expertise on that. But you and I will both accept.
I have expertise on that.
Sure, but you and I will both agree that there are two versions of that story, and that people are unable to agree on that. And I don't want to get into that. That's been something that's been debated 1,000 times. But what I'm suggesting is that when a typical young black man sees that, they remember maybe an incident, maybe many incidents, when they were just treated discourteously or treated in a way that they would not have been treated if they were white. And they think that could have been me. And that is then emblematic.
Well, you have instances where people believe that they are being mistreated and truly are not. For instance, that when there is law enforcement tries to be responsive to the statistical approaches to law enforcement. When I say that, I mean, okay, there's a certain amount of blocks in a city. Mm-hmm. There now, because of all of the advents in technology, law enforcement can look and say, okay, at these 3 blocks, we're having these are the highest crime areas in the city. Mm-hmm. So in order to be responsive to that crime that is statistical, they will put additional resources into that area to enforce laws and deter crime. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you do that? You do that by making car stops, by making pedestrian stops, by looking and proactively trying to stop crime. So if you look at a lot of police officers in a relatively small area where where is the crime being committed, and who are the people that are committing the crimes? In minority communities, the people committing the crimes are minorities. Mm-hmm. In a black community, the white people aren't flooding into the area to commit crimes against blacks. That's not happening. What's happening is black gang members and other criminals are preying on the good people who live in that area. So who are police going to stop and make contacts with in that area? It's going to be those who fit the descriptions of the people committing the crimes. So
do you think it's possible? Do you think it's possible that that is colored by the prejudice of some cops?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No, it's just factual. If you're policing a minority community, you're going to be stopping minorities.
Okay.
That's
okay.
And here's the
then
problem.
Respond to this one then. All of the research outside of criminal justice. So, for example, surveys on drug use, hospital records on drug use, all interactions with healthcare and so forth, indicate that there isn't much difference between the drug use of different ethnic groups. That basically black people use drugs more or less at the same rate as white people. But black people are arrested vastly more often for drug use. Now, they may be guilty, or almost all of them may be guilty, but the likelihood of getting arrested for drug use is far higher for a black person. The likelihood of getting incarcerated for drug use is far higher for a black person. And the prisons are literally stuffed full of black men who are non-violent drug offenders.
You need to do some statistical analysis because that's not actually true. There are, in order to get into prison, I know that it sounds like that there are nonviolent drug offenders that are flooding the prisons. That's actually not factual.
The study I have here is that black people are 2.6 times more likely to get arrested for drug crimes, even though they're committing those crimes at the same rate as white people.
You can get statistical analysis that will say pretty much anything that you want to.
No, this is peer-reviewed research. This is very high-quality research.
Okay, well, let me give you some realities.
Okay.
Okay. You'll recall why the methodology used in putting Al Capone in prison.
He went to jail for tax crimes.
Correct. Why did they utilize that statute, or a tax crime, which is considered basically a low-level crime? Why did they use that to put him into prison?
Because they could put him into prison with statistical evidence which didn't rely on getting witnesses from his community because they were all being intimidated. So they could get somebody who worked in the tax office to say he paid no tax. We can see he's living a high life. Therefore, he's cheating on his taxes. Therefore, he goes to prison.
Correct. Right. So was he a nonviolent offender?
Absolutely not.
Correct. So let me. I lived through the crack epidemic of the 80s, where there was, generally speaking, crack was controlled by gangs. Mm-hmm. They had the turf, and they
not generally, always.
For the most part, yes. So how did the gang members protect their turf? They killed people, or they shot them, or they assaulted them, or they beat them, or whatever. So we would know who was committing these crimes. Our investigative stuff, we knew who was committing the crimes, but just like Al Capone, we couldn't prove it because nobody would testify against them. So how did we put them in jail? We put them in jail using drug crimes, right? We would actively pursue them because the underlying issue was dope. So you would arrest them for selling dope, which is a felony offense, but it is when you look at it statistically, it's a nonviolent drug offense. Well, we put thousands of violent offenders in prison using that course of action. That is now being turned against law enforcement in just the same way that you just did it. That the prisons are chock full of non-violent drug offenders. Are you suggesting
that they are actually violent, but they just have not been convicted of those crimes of violence, and they've been convicted of some other crime of convenience, let's say?
Yes.
That seems difficult to believe just because of the vast numbers. So, for example, I'm looking at FBI statistics from 2013, that almost 1 in 1,000 black person was arrested for drug-related offences in that year alone, which was about 2.5 times the number of white people who were arrested. Is that really credible?
I'm not quite sure that I understood what you just said.
Almost 1 in 1,000 black people were arrested in 1 year for drug offences. That's a huge, huge number. Are you suggesting that they're all?
No, not all. But the reality is, in order to get actually a prison sentence,
mm-hmm.
I have never seen, ever, in 34 years of policing, I've never seen anyone go to prison on a first-time drug offense, no matter what that offense was, other than some huge drug deal, where you're talking about
mm-hmm.
about large amounts of cocaine. I've never seen anybody go to jail for marijuana. I've never seen anybody go to jail for possession of cocaine or methamphetamine.
Although they could get a record that would pretty much ruin their lives.
Well, if they are in possession of that, isn't that what police are supposed to do? Is make arrests when they
Probably I shouldn't talk about drug policy with somebody who's involved in enforcement and not policy. But just to switch it up a little bit, what do you think of the TV show Cops?
Well, since I was on it for three seasons, I have to say that maybe I'm prejudiced, but I think it did actually a lot of good for policing.
How so?
Because it was a first reality show,
mm-hmm.
and
it was literally the first reality show, wasn't it?
Literally, and I was on the second season of the first reality show, maybe 6 episodes on the show. Now, when they came to me and asked if I would ride with them.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about it and I said, I will, because I believe that this show will show the reality of being a police officer when the only information that people got on the media was from movies and scripted television shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it did just that. People came to me. I can't tell you. I got hundreds of communications from people going, I had no idea that you guys had to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was very positive. I think it was educational. It revealed, the realities of a lot of the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it had a significant impact on the way people view police.
And there's now Live PD. It's not perhaps as iconic, but it's a very influential TV show nonetheless. What do you make of Michael Moore's criticism that you see on the Cops TV show, people, cops running down the street and jumping on a drug dealer or whatever? You don't ever see cops bursting into an investment banker's office and cuffing him, even though they've committed crimes that have put millions of people into misery.
Well, Michael Moore, I've had one-on-one debates with Michael Moore, and Michael Moore is a big old blowhard.
Never mind the personality. The point is that Wall Street crimes don't enter the public consciousness in the same way.
Well, when you're talking about cops, it's an entertainment show, or Live PD. They're looking at street cops who are doing street work. When you're talking about, they're just looking at ratings. They're not looking at going in and arresting an investment banker. Why would you even, bring up a television show when it comes down to the reality of policing, and Michael Moore criticizing that cops are live PD doesn't show investment bankers getting arrested. That to me is an inane kind of comparison.
Oh, but hang on a second. Companies like Lehman Brothers, AIG, Enron and so forth, there were people in there committing very serious crimes that put millions of people out of jobs and into misery. That's relevant. And when you have a level of focus on, for example, somebody selling $20 worth of marijuana that you don't get on those enormous crimes, that does tend to skew the public view of it, doesn't it?
You're completely going outside the lines of normalcy here. When you're talking about, are police investigating those serious crimes? Of course they are. The FBI exists to investigate those type of crimes. Do they belong in prison? Hell yes. But when you're talking about television and then jumping in with the police arresting people on street crimes, you're talking about apples and oranges. Law enforcement officers get a huge amount of satisfaction of putting bad guys in jail. Well, they couldn't care less whether those bad guys are wearing 3-piece suits and working in an investment bank, or that they are attacking citizens. Cops want to put bad guys in jail, and there are tons of white-collar criminals going to jail. So it's happening. Just because it's not on television on a reality show doesn't have any bearing on it.
Randy Sutton, retired police lieutenant from Las Vegas Police Department, the founder of Wounded Blue and author of many books on policing. Thank you very much for talking to me.
My pleasure.
Have you read a blog post or an opinion piece that you think is really right or really wrong? Tell us why. Email podcast@challengingopinions.com and let's discuss it on the next show.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow Randy Sutton @LTRandySutton. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks to everyone who's signed up as a patron on Patreon so far. I really appreciate those people. They help me to devote more time to researching topics and guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/challengingopinions, or you'll find that link on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. Coming up next Monday, that's March 9th, I'll be talking to the pastor and black Republican Demetrius Minor. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.